Hi everyone, welcome. Thanks so much for joining for our teach-in today. So we're here with ABCD Yogi. That is myself, I'm Ria, and Tejal from Tejal Yoga. And we're here with folks from Yogis for Palestine with Aniqa and Sheena, who will give a bit of a longer introduction of themselves here in a moment. Just to give a brief introduction of ABCD Yogi and of our teach-in, ABCD Yogi, if you are not familiar, is a hub and a community for healing and learning. And we are just so excited for this event, for this teach-in. It's so timely. And with regards to talking about omwashing, talking about the rise of ethnonationalism, and it's so pertinent for so many people across identities, and just really excited to be also collaborating with Race and Yoga Journal, Lala Lil Jadar, and all sorts of folks who have been behind the scenes to get this going. So with that, we'll just orient ourselves briefly around some access needs. So thank you so much for joining live. It's lovely to have you here. And to ensure access for everyone, we ask that you please just keep your mics muted during the presentation. You can click to enable the closed captions. On your Zoom in the toolbar panel, you can select show captions, or if the screen is minimized, you can go to more captions and show captions. If you need any help or have any questions, you can start a direct chat with myself, ABC Yogi Village, or Tejal for ABCD Yogi, any questions or support around tech or access. Please direct any questions you have on materials in our group chat to everyone in the meeting. So we do have a Q&A portion where we will mostly be addressing our questions at the end. So we will be keeping track of those questions as they come in. So like we mentioned, please just keep yourself on mute unless you're in breakouts. We'll have a couple breakout sessions for some small group conversation or until Q&A. We also ask that you respect one another and the facilitators, and please refrain from using any hateful language in the chat and in discussions. We will be removing folks who do engage in any sort of hateful language in the space. We welcome you to enter with openness and a curiosity to learn. And we want to acknowledge that conflict can be generative and principled, striving to be curious before furious and challenge the ideas, not the people. Also, be sure to take care of yourself and your needs. Discomfort is a natural part of the learning process. We invite you to sit with discomfort, notice how it feels in your body, and just take care and tend to yourself in any way that you need. If you need to keep your videos off throughout, you're more than welcome to do so. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Sheena and Aniqa for a bit of introduction on themselves.
Hello, thank you, Ria. Thank you, ABCD Yogi. Thank you, Tejal, for this space that you've curated for us to be able to have this conversation today. Thank you so much to Lala Lil Jidar, an artist collective that's somewhat based here out of Philly, but also moving itself in other places, and to Race and Yoga Journal, a journal that I encourage people who write to check out. I'm Sheena Sood. I use she, her pronouns. I am really excited to be here today for this conversation. I'm tuning in from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Please let me know in the chat if you can't hear me for any reason at any point. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, otherwise known as occupied Lenni Lenape territories. And I am just grateful to my co-conspirator and collaborator, Aniqa, for being here as part of this really important and timely conversation, for all the collaboration we've been able to do together for and through Yogis for Palestine these past few months. As many of us know and possibly feel, right? Doing this work during a really tragic time in the world can be hard, and it's also been a really healing salve to the wounded hearts that I know that I carry, as well as many of us carry in this moment, And I just want to say that being able to do this work with someone like Aniqa has been um, a really inspiring process because she's really helped me tend to my own wounds in a way that allows me to show up in solidarity. And so I'm really grateful for the work and the collective that we've built through this. And I'm sure I'll get to know some of you today, but I'm just really grateful to all of you for arriving and showing up in this space with an open heart, with an open mind. And I'm excited to share a bit of myself and to share space with each of you today. And so with that in mind, in order to have an honest conversation, in order for us to be able to talk about the weaponization of yoga, I feel like it's important for me to be transparent about my own positionality and my own lens that I'm entering this conversation today. Firstly, as a South Asian American who's having a conversation on the weaponization of yoga, I want to acknowledge that I enter this conversation as a South Asian who's both a descendant of ancestors and parents who survived British colonialism and partition as it affected the present day Punjabi region of India and Pakistan. And I also enter this conversation as a descendant of upper caste Hindus. I share that latter part because it's important for me to name how my upper caste Hindu background has played and continues to play a role in upholding the colonization and weaponization of yoga through caste-based Hindu supremacy. And if you have questions about that, don't worry, I'll share a little bit more about my experiences with Hindus and caste supremacy later today. I'm indebted to marginalized South Asians of Muslim, lower caste, Dalit, Adivasi, Christian, Sikh, and other backgrounds who've had the humility and taken the time to share their analysis and experiences with me that have allowed me to be able to present the material in this workshop today. And then I'm a sociologist, an activist scholar, and a yoga teacher with 13 plus years of experience building community with healers, community organizers, and activist scholars in my home in Philly. I've been facilitating decolonizing yoga workshops in my home and in Philly and virtually for over 6 years. I'm a co-founder of Yogis for Palestine, and maybe some of you know, but this is a collective that emerged actually in May 2021 in the aftermath of the Israeli evictions in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in occupied East Jerusalem during a previous period of Israel's bombardment in Gaza and settlement building and militarism in the occupied West Bank. Myself and a former collaborator I want to lift up, Sonali Siddiqui, authored our first solidarity statement on International Yoga Day in 2021, calling on yogis to disrupt the status quo of yoga teachers remaining silent on the call for Palestinian liberation. And 2 years later, Aniqa and I wrote a subsequent statement and have been organizing donation-based educational and healing offerings in Philly since then because we believe in the liberatory potential of yoga. And then finally, I'm a mama to a beautiful pup named Cora. If you're a Legend of Korra fan, yay. She's also the star and mascot of my kids' yoga program, Yoga Warrior Tales. And I'll turn it over to Aniqa to introduce herself as well.
Thank you so much, Sheena, and thank you for providing all of that background as to how Yogis for Palestine came about. It's so nice to be here with all of you. My name is Aniqa Anwar. My pronouns are she, her, and I am speaking from Philadelphia, which is colonized Lenni Lenape land, as Sheena pointed out. I grew up in Bangladesh, and my family is Muslim, although I don't directly practice right now. And so I hold the identity of being from a formerly colonized nation and then also possessing the identity of living on colonized land. There's tension there. And that tension is really playing out in a lot of what is happening today. And my role in this, I am a newer teacher. I got my teacher training in 2021. I have been practicing yoga for a lot longer, but I wanted to teach yoga because I saw how powerful yoga can be in order to help us turn towards what is happening in the world and the suffering in the world and figure out how we show up effectively. And that's really one of the reasons why I wanted to be a teacher. And for the past 2 years, I've been teaching in different spaces. And Sheena and I actually met. I took Sheena's decolonizing yoga workshop as part of my advanced teacher training. And it's how I started to think more about what it means to use yoga for liberation, because yoga itself is not good or bad, and it can be purposed either way. It can be purposed for harm, or it can be purposed for justice. And it's on people like all of us to purpose it towards justice. And a large part of how I got involved with Yogis for Palestine was in October 2023. I was just completely heartbroken at the silence that was happening in the yoga space and yoga communities in my own former studio, and just really waiting for the people that I thought would speak up to speak up and not hearing anything. And sort of out of that heartbreak, I saw Sheena post about writing a statement in solidarity with Palestine. And that's sort of how we got into this work. And this space has been such an important channel, not just to name what is happening, but also call folks into solidarity, and nudging them towards action in whatever way feels meaningful to them. And I truly, truly believe that this is yoga at its best. And I'm so excited to be here and talk about. Sheena's going to cover the systemic violence, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what we've seen in local studios and ways that we can disrupt the silence and neutrality and the weaponization. So we'll also talk about that a little bit. So yeah, thank you all so much. I'll pass it over to Sheena.
All right. Thank you, Anika. Folks can hear me. Remind me if I do not come off mute, because that might happen at some point. Before we get this workshop started, I just want to take a moment and ground us with a land acknowledgement. And then we'll get into more of the groundings of today. We don't actually have a formal meditation or breathing section to today's workshop. So if you're someone who benefits from taking a few deep breaths before we get into this material, I want to welcome you to take some deep breaths as we do this land acknowledgement. Maybe by closing or dimming your eyes, if that helps you ground in. So just taking a moment to just notice where your body is and where your breath is, if that feels appealing to you. So there is no way to talk about oppression or appropriation without naming that the material basis of that oppression is the theft of Indigenous homelands on Turtle Island, which is what various Indigenous nations call this land that we are on. Without that, the colonial relationship between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, the material relationship would not be possible to build oppression on. A land acknowledgement allows us to not simply acknowledge the ongoing colonial relationship, but to also name that giving land back is part of the journey of acknowledging the soft power of Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, which we'll talk about, Zionism, and ethnonationalism. In a workshop about yoga and ethno-nationalism, a land acknowledgement is especially important. The racial hierarchy as we know it is based on the material foundation of land theft in the lands of First Nations people around the world. And it's based on ongoing genocidal policies against Indigenous people and the national cultures, whether it's in the US or Palestine or Australia or India, that excuse and glorify the violent actions through myths of superiority and historical erasure. So it's important to know where we are from, right? Whose land we are on. Me and Aniqa here in Philadelphia, which is a colonial name. The Lenape and Osage nations stewarded fisheries, rivers, and islands. The Osage called this place Coaquanac, which means grove of tall pines. The Lenape called the whole of this area Lenape-Hoking, which meant land of the original people. It's a crossroads of many indigenous nations which developed thriving political and economic relations prior to colonization. And since then, the Lenape and Osage have continued to fight for their cultural survival and their physical survival. The point that Lenape descendants have put forth is that the push for a land acknowledgement is part of the process of organizing for land back. We give thanks to the Lenape for their struggle. It's because of their perseverance that we are able to gather here today. Of course, the Lenape are not the only people to acknowledge. On almost every continent, Indigenous people care for the majority of biodiversity on this land and on the planet. We all benefit from the activism and stewardship of Indigenous peoples like the Lenape, Maori, Kanaka Maoli, Ogoni, Adivasi, and others. Their work teaches us that the crises facing our world have no borders. We will continue to take that lesson of abolishing borders and decolonization as central to our workshop today. And so if you have your eyes closed or dimmed, I'll welcome you to kind of awaken them. We get to have less than a couple hours together today, and I promise you we have a packed agenda. We want to make the most of our time together. The following is a glance at our flow for the day. We're going to start with an audience poll and breakout groups, and then we'll spend some time contextualing what brings us here and me sharing about this framework of omwashing that I've developed and the experiences that have brought me to this analysis. Next, we're going to go collectively on a gallery gaze of images that exemplify the practice of omwashing, and we'll do some reflections on what we heard and saw. And then I'll turn it over to Aniqa to share about how we've been collectively working together to implement the principles of decolonizing yoga by bringing this work home to our yoga studios and spaces to interrupt the status quo of those studios endorsing genocide, and to invite yoga studios to open up their space to call for decolonization in a liberatory Palestine. Then we want to offer y'all some time for breakout groups again, because all of us, I'm sure, have brilliant ideas on how we can continue to use yoga to interrupt and dismantle Zionism. And then we'll have time for concluding thoughts, next steps, and Q&A. So hopefully that sounds good to folks. We're certainly excited to hear from you. There's so many of you here. And so, we're going to try and make the most of our time and give us all a chance to get to know each other a little bit. So now we're going to take a quick audience poll to get an idea of who's in the space. I think Ria and Thejal set up a 3-question poll that's going to pop up. It just popped up on my screen. Hopefully it popped up on yours. And I'll read them aloud as these questions pop up, but you should see them. Oh, great. And they're all 3 there. So do you identify as someone who practices yoga or is a student of yoga? Do you identify as a yoga teacher? And then please select yes if you do not identify as a yoga student or practitioner and are here for a different reason, perhaps a desire to learn about how art and culture can be used to dismantle Zionism and Israeli apartheid and to work toward a liberated Palestine. All right. And there's no right answer here, as maybe some of us can intuit, but there are a lot of people who are like, it looks like unanimously folks who are in the space practice yoga, those who answered. And quite a number of us identify as yoga teachers. Yeah, the majority clearly do. Great. Are folks on your end able to see the audience poll, the participation and the stats, or is that just me? Yeah, you can see it? No? Okay. So I'm seeing 34 out of 34 who answered question 1 answered yes. Do you identify as someone who practices yoga or a student of yoga? I'm seeing for question 2, do you identify as a yoga teacher? That 27 out of 34, which is 79%, said yes. And, oh, some people see it. Okay, cool. And then the last one, a few of us, 3 out of 25 who answered, selected that they do not identify as a yoga student or practitioner, maybe here for a different reason. So thanks for your participation. It's just good to thank you for sharing the results. Perfect. So I will minimize that for now, and then we'll maybe come back to it or just use it as a reference point at some point. So now another quick activity. In a moment, you're going to be invited to join a Zoom breakout group with 4 to 5 other people about. You'll be in a breakout group for 4 minutes. And after joining it, I just want to welcome y'all to take turns introducing yourself to your group. and perhaps sharing the following. Why are you here today at this teach-in? What has your experience been in your yoga spaces since the start of Israel's escalation of the genocide in Gaza? What are ways in which you've used your yoga practice to call for a ceasefire and an end to genocide, or for an end to Israel's apartheid and occupation in Palestine? So if that makes sense and folks are clear with that, I don't know if we need to post that in the chat itself. Oh, great. Thank you. Whoever did that. You're great. Great. And then I believe we'll get a welcome to some breakout groups momentarily. Let me know if there are any tech issues around that. Welcome back, folks. I'm not looking at the full screen, but I'm assuming everyone is back here. Yeah. So thank you all for taking some time to share with each other. Hopefully you made some connections. Hopefully you feel less isolated or alone in your efforts. And while we definitely want to hear more of what folks have been doing, for the sake of time, we won't necessarily share back now. But if you feel compelled to share in the chat something that someone shared, while honoring, not sharing names, then you're more than welcome to do that. If you want to share why you're here today, we welcome that, or ways you've used yoga to disrupt and interrupt Zionism. So with that in mind, we'll move on to contextualizing this moment. So why are we here? Why are we here today? For one, we're 160 days into witnessing Israel's atrocious genocide and ethnic cleansing campaign on the people of Gaza and the occupied West Bank, and their wholesale attack on the humanity of Palestinians. At least over 31,000 civilian deaths, over 75,000 injuries. The encroaching ground invasion in Rafah. Universities, homes, schools, hospitals have been destroyed. Mainstream news outlets and our own countries continue to validate Israel's right to defend itself. Israeli settlers building settlements in the occupied West Bank. Over 400 Palestinians murdered in the West Bank since October 7th. And if you're tuning in from the US, you know that our tax dollars directly contribute to this genocide by arming Israel without any stoppage, while we're simultaneously sending aid, right? So if you're tuning in from another country that's complicit in genocide, feel free to share how your country you feel is complicit. All of us are here together in a virtual yoga space, gathering to have conversation on yoga and spirituality, and how yoga and spirituality are not immune to being complicit in state and colonial violence. And in this case, complicit and being appropriated by Zionists and Hindu nationalists and white supremacist allies to advance far-right, ethno-nationalist, and religious supremacist agendas. So with that in mind, with all that context, I want to introduce the framework that I'm using to help ground us in this analysis. So omwashing is a framework I developed to address how far-right ethno-nationalists appropriate yoga to advance agendas of state and colonial violence. My research specifically looks at how colonial and ethno-nationalist state governments and political leaders and institutions co-opt yoga in the military and law enforcement and vigilante and paramilitary settings to project an image of peace and democracy and to conceal their structurally violent and supremacist ideologies. Omwashing builds on the scholarship and the frameworks of pinkwashing and greenwashing, if we've heard about those, but specifically relates to historic and contemporary examples of the co-optation of mindfulness, yoga, meditation, and other spiritual practices and healing tools by these fascist groups by religious supremacist groups. And I do see a question about taking screenshots. That's fine by me. Yeah. All right, so if you're ready to get sick, to demonstrate the relationship between imperialism, militarism, and yoga, we want to start off with two examples of the weaponization of yoga by the Israeli military. So we're going to see them back to back, and I'll just describe them a bit beforehand. In the first example, we see Nissim Aman, a former Israeli soldier turned Zen Buddhist master and meditation instructor, whose instructional video teaching soldiers in the Israeli military to breathe and remain calm while bombing Palestinians went viral at the end of last year. In mid-November, Aman recorded a video for the IOF, a military that for years has falsely called itself the most moral army in the world. And he invited soldiers to use their breath and mind to be super fighters while committing mass murder. In this video, he calls on Israeli soldiers to use Zen Buddhism and mindfulness as tools of colonial violence and to be more precise in their slaughtering of Palestinians. The second example is a video by a yoga instructor who just completed her first healing retreat for Israeli soldiers. It's a screen recording of a post that has since been deleted. Maybe, yeah, agitators got to her. I'm just going to show us portions of that one because it's a 4-minute video. As much as we may have no desire to watch these videos, it's important to witness how Zionists use yoga and mindfulness to omwash their war crimes. While for some of us, we may encounter yogis in yoga studios who remain silent on genocide, these are actually two examples of how Zionists use yoga and healing to advance genocide and to perpetuate war crimes and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. In other words, material examples of how yoga is used to advance a colonial agenda, actively advance it. So let's take a look. I want to welcome us to take in what we see as we're watching it, if we feel compelled to use the chat to express our thoughts and reactions. So I know this is going to connect to another tab. Once I click on it, folks, can you still see this? Yeah? Okay. I'm going to start it over.
להיות לוחם על. ההבדל בין להיות לוחם על ולהיות לוחם סתם זה במיינד. תשמעו, מה שצריך זה לשמור על קור רוח ודיוק. ובמעשיות של זה אומר, כשאתם יורים, לוקחים את החצי שנייה, לכוון, ואז לראות, ואז לשחרר. וזה כל ההבדל בין לוחמי על לאנשים שנבהלים ויורים, ועוד שני דברים. הכי גרוע זה לראות בצרורות, לא פוגעים ומבזבזים המון תחמושת. הרי מהקנה יש צינורית שמחזירה את הגז, חלק מהגז שיוצא, להחזיר את המכלול אחורה, לפנות את התרמיל ולהכניס כדור חדש לבית הבליעה. והצינורית הזאת היא דוחקת למעלה, והצרור הוא מעלה את הנשק, ולכן ירי בצרור הוא מיותר לגמרי. אז דבר אחד זה לכוון, לעצור את הנשימה ולראות בבודדת או בזוג. צרורות זה עוד דבר טוב. זוכרים שהיה פעם שאבירים היו עושים דו-קרב? מי שהיה מנצח זה לא מישהו יותר מהיר כמו במערב הפרוע. בדרך כלל מה שקורה זה שהיד שלהם הייתה רועדת מרוב פחד. וכל הגדולה היא להיות, לנשום, לעצור את הנשימה, לכוון, ובלי פחד, להיות מדויקים ולראות. לגבי החלק השלישי, של אחרי הקרב, לחזור, לנוח, להגיד הכל בסדר. לא לטחון אשמה, לא לטחון חרטות, ולא להתייסר, אלא פשוט לנסות לנוח. יהיה זמן אחר כך, ותחזרו הביתה, נעשה עבודה. העבודה תהיה לפרוק, ולספר, ולשתף, ולבכות. הרבה לבכות. אבל לא בקרב. בקרב, ותוך כדי שאתם שם, יהיו קולים, בלי מסכנות, בלי רחם עצמיים, נסיכים ונסיכות. שלנו אתם, גאווה לאומית, לוחמי על. קחו את הזמן, דיוק, סבלנות, אורך רוח. וזה מה שיהפוך אתכם ללוחמים הכי מוצלחים שיעשו את העבודה. והם מחכים לכם כבר ותחזרו הביתה בשלום. בהצלחה לכם. הכל יהיה בסדר.
So I'm going to move into another video, and I'm also going to try and get it into full screen so that we can see it. So y'all get the idea. Y'all can see this Israeli soldiers retreat slide, am I correct? Okay. This is a translation of an advertisement for the retreat. This was some of the caption. I couldn't fit all of it in with the video. On February 26th, we hosted our first retreat for Israeli soldiers. Grateful and honored to have an opportunity to serve these heroes. How inspiring each one of you is, Star. Thank you for being an incredible force of light in this world. I just want to acknowledge that what we watched are forms of propaganda that have made us feel uncomfortable, disgusted, sickened, repelled by the appropriation of yoga for genocide. Just to note that these retreats holders are and the Israeli army are fundraising to host these retreats as refugees from Rafah, Gaza, and Palestine are simultaneously living in an environment of perpetual trauma and warfare and fundraising to evacuate genocide. So if you just want to take a few moments, take a couple breaths and maybe like shake out what you're feeling, or even just let out a scream or a sigh, I welcome that. No, we are not trying to watch more of that. Okay. So now I'm going to transition to a portion of the workshop where you're going to hear me lecture for a few minutes, more than a few minutes. I'm going to share some autoethnographic reflections that led me to first contemplate what I understand to be the weaponization of yoga and spirituality toward advancing oppressive political agendas. These are experiences that gave me the language to develop the framework and theoretical paradigm of omwashing. Some of you may recognize the yoga spiritual guru pictured here, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, not to be confused with the sitar player, the late sitar player, Ravi Shankar. When I was 19, I attended a meditation workshop by the Art of Living Foundation, an international nonprofit founded by Sri Sri Ravi Shankar. He's known for his unique approach to sharing meditative, yogic breathing skills with everyday people. The Art of Living is a spiritual and allegedly humanitarian organization that's not directly affiliated with one religious group, but Sri Sri, as many of his followers refer to him, pulls heavily from Hindu and Vedantic philosophies. I started attending Art of Living spiritual retreats when I was first acquiring a language to unpack my experiences with white supremacy and colonialism as a second-generation immigrant who was born and raised in the U.S. South. I attended retreats that Sri Sri traveled to the US for, and was, if I'm being honest, also mesmerized with his light and his wisdom. As an additional comfort, several of my Art of Living teachers, or AOL teachers, were Indian and spoke openly about their families' memories of British colonialism and partition. The combination of these experiences led me to deepen my relationship to Hinduism and Indian culture and history. I even became a leader in my Hindu Student Council, or HSC chapter in college. and felt as if AOL and HSC offered me a sense of belonging to my religiously racialized ethnic identity, an identity that I felt I had subconsciously disembodied to fit into a white cultural norm. Despite their ability to locate the harm of colonial and racial logics on our shared homeland, my AOL teachers and HSC peers are also the ones who introduced me to narratives about South Asia that were embedded in Islamophobic, casteist, and Hindu nationalist ideologies. They indoctrinated me into religious political conflicts in different regions of South Asia, for instance, in occupied Kashmir, Assam, Bengal, Gujarat, through a Hindu and caste supremacist lens. Narratives that made it seem as if caste-based hierarchies were vestiges of the past and ones that claimed Hindus to be the eternal victims of Muslim invasions. For those who are less familiar with the caste system, or what is also known as Brahmanism, I've posted an image that helps explain the origins in the hierarchical structure of caste supremacy. The caste system refers to a socio-religious hierarchy that is inherent to Hinduism, caste, or Varna, or that is inherent to Hinduism, and caste, what's also known as Varna, dictates one's place in society. It's fixed in the sense that one is born into a particular caste and it cannot be changed over the course of their life, right? Unlike class, theoretically class. As you might interpret, caste has an impact on one's economic standing in society, their labor, their privilege, their power, and so caste is inherently oppressive. And it continues to bear a considerable impact on social policy, economic standing, and hierarchy across the diaspora of South Asians. So I grew up in a family belonging to the Kshatriya caste, regarded as an upper caste designation. And I'll admit, caste was rarely addressed in my family and household, often because it's assumed to be a thing of the past, because of its legal elimination from Indian society, according to the Constitution. But it's still very much alive and embedded in the social hierarchies of South Asian society. So something I came to develop a deeper awareness of as an adult was the way in which caste influenced my life. It dictates much in Indian society and has a deep, often unquestioned presence in yoga philosophy. And not just in India, often in Western glorifications of yoga too. So as I participated in the Art of Living and Hindu Student Council organizations, even though I could feel the tentacles of Hindu nationalism or Hindutva sucking me into a web of fictitious claims around the innocence of upper caste Hindus, I didn't immediately relinquish my belonging to these groups. It took me a couple of years. And so while we're on definitions, I want to share the definition of Hindutva that I'm using today. Hindutva is a term that refers to the ideology of Hindu supremacy, an ideology whose roots are in Brahmanism or the caste system, right? So we get Hindu nationalism because of casteism or indirect connection to it. And Hindutva is an ideology that believes in and advocates for Hindu supremacy in the context of the nation state of India. And so, although India has constitutionally been regarded as a secular state since its formation in 1947 or its independence, the Hindu nationalist movement seeks to transform India into a Hindu Rashtra or a Hindu nation. And so what that means is transforming India into an ethno-nationalist or ethno-religious state that privileges Hindus. And the Hindu nationalist movement can trace its roots and connections to the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is kind of a paramilitary vigilante organization that's taken inspiration from historic fascist movements such as Italian fascism and Nazi Germany. And so around 2007, at a time when I started building up the courage to ask questions about the one-sided narratives that I was being fed, I learned about the 2002 Gujarat pogrom, which is also known as a 3 or 4 day period of anti-Muslim violence that was propelled by Hindu nationalist gangs and resulted in the murder of nearly 2,000 Muslims. Evidence points to the role that then Chief Minister Narendra Modi, now Prime Minister of India, and the Gujarat police played in instigating and condoning the orchestrated and mass murder and brutal assault on thousands of Muslim families in Ahmedabad. At the time of learning about this, I searched for accountability from the spiritual and religious leadership in the Hindu Student Council and the Art of Living, but instead found testimonials by Sri Sri defending and excusing Modi from culpability. I'll pause for a moment on if anyone wants to read this to themselves, but basically Sri Sri here is talking about how Modi is framing him as a victim of the media and talks about his attempt to confront Modi and his ultimate decision to sympathize with and trust Modi's claims of innocence in sanctioning this violent pogrom. Contrary to Sri Sri's blind defense of Modi, in 2012, Human Rights Watch documented how the Gujarat state and police officials continue to deny and obstruct justice in the investigations, even a decade later. And as recently as last year in January, the BBC released a two-part documentary, India, the Modi Question, that illustrates how Modi greenlit the genocidal violence. And in response, the Indian government and spiritual leaders have been dismissing the documentary as propaganda and have even banned it from airing in India and other parts of the globe. So after learning more about Sri Sri's support for Modi, I felt betrayed, but also as if a blindfold had been lifted. Sri Sri's use of spirituality to bypass the contradictions of Hindu nationalism were telling. In turning a blind eye to Hindu nationalism's violent political agenda, he encouraged me to question my place in spirituality, as well as my place in the Hindu Student Council and Art of Living. I was no longer willing to trust their theological doctrines, for they were complicit in justifying hatred, violence, oppression, and inequality. And the experience I had validated the tension I had begun to feel with faith-based practices. Although I had come to these communities with a desire for belonging, identity, and ancestral healing, I was also fed dangerously manipulative propaganda about South Asian social history through Hindu elitist and supremacist perspectives. I knew I had to follow the path of disrupting their violently oppressive agendas. And so, unable to reckon with the weaponization of spirituality, I left AOL, HSC, and my yoga practice for some time. I've since written about some of these experiences in publications like Race and Yoga Journal, Al Jazeera, in a newly published Yoga Teacher Survival's Guide, and how these experiences propelled me to step into a more spiritual and liberatory yoga practice, or a journey that ultimately took me to India for my yoga teacher training, but not without experiences of weaponization, just maybe a skeptical eye towards weaponization. So the second time I was confronted with the weaponization of yoga was when I traveled to McLeodganj, India for a yoga teacher training in 2011. When I shared a taxi with an Israeli tourist I met on the plane ride from New Delhi to Dharamshala. Having lived between India and Israel since his formal discharge from the Israeli Defense Force, or the Israeli Occupation Force, Yoav confided in me that his journey to India helped him heal his traumas and find his calling as a yoga teacher and Reiki practitioner. He shared, Israelis have a natural gravitation toward Indian culture. That's why thousands of my people visit India. Hinting at how Israelis in India throw wild parties, attend meditation retreats, become some of the most popular yoga teachers, and often settle in villages in Himachal Pradesh for extended periods of time. As we parted ways, he wished me an enlightening month and insisted that I visit Dharamkot, a nearby village that many Israeli tourists had settled in, before leaving McLeodganj. In walking through these villages, I started noticing signs on walking trails and roads, signs marked in Hebrew but never in Urdu, and the number of menu items in cafes that advertised Israeli salads, or what Palestinians in the occupied territories know to be everyday Palestinian salads. I became intrigued by the habitual practice of these soldiers flocking to India after compulsory military service to de-stress from the trauma of serving as agents in a military that aggressively brutalizes and displaces Palestinians. I began questioning why they traveled to India to study spirituality after completing their service in what Palestinians regard as a settler occupying military force. I observed that instead of using these practices to interrogate their oppressive violence, these Israeli soldiers were using mindfulness and yoga as tools to relieve the stress they had accrued while serving in a settler occupying military. This is what I understand as well to be the weaponization of yoga. Rather than using yoga to deepen self-awareness regarding their participation in a genocidal project decimating Palestinian life, these veterans were using yoga to bypass cultivating such awareness. Now, this fellow yogi who I met, Yoav, is not the only Israeli tourist to study yoga and spirituality in India. Notably, since the normalization of diplomatic relations between Israel and India, as Azad Essa demonstrates in his 2003 text, Hostile Homelands, the phenomenon of Israeli tourists traveling to India and other countries across the global south to decompress after leaving the IOF has become a growing trend. Times of India reports that the town of Dharamkot, often referred to as Tel Aviv of the Hills by locals, has become a high-end tourist destination, thanks to the vision of Israelis who have been traveling there since the 1990s. Similarly, nearby Kasol, also referred to as Mini Israel, is another scenic town that Israelis flock to and settle in after finishing their mandatory military conscription. These towns have become sites of large-scale spiritual decompression and healing for Israelis, especially those coming out of the military. Opportunities that the Palestinians they are bombing and strangling under a checkpoint system apartheid never have the chance to experience. A scholar, Rumia Puchia, offers that these trends of yoga tourism in India are predicated on Western notions of South Asians as the racialized other, as well they're also used by the Indian nation to extend an ethno-nationalist agenda. And they position India as the site where tourists can find true purpose and saviorhood and indulge in escapist fantasies. Which begs the question, what are IOF soldiers using yoga and meditation to escape from? How are they using it to indulge in their fantasies of fulfilling an ethno-state? So I had enrolled in yoga training in India, thinking my major concerns around colonization and yoga would revolve around confronting issues of race and white supremacy, and me feeling like a foreigner in a touristy spiritual town in India. And honestly, after completing my certification, I had a fairly flattened analysis of race and yoga. But later I started wondering how my analysis could be sharpened to incorporate these material examples of yoga's weaponization for imperial and religious supremacist agendas, and these examples of how it is used to advance in this case, a Zionist colonial agenda. So I imagine, and I'm going to spend very little time on this slide, but we can come back to it, that some of us have an understanding of Zionism already. This is the definition of Zionism that I'm using, based on the material reality of how Zionism has been used as a process of settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and genocide for over 75 years. So understanding it to be a modern political movement and ideology that emerged in the late 19th century and drove the establishment of the Jewish ethno-state of Israel. And modern Zionism continues to advocate for the maintenance of a Jewish ethno-state in historic Palestine. So as much as it emerged as a response to violent anti-Semitism and the persecution of Jewish people in Europe during the 19th and 20th century, as opposed to working to dismantle anti-Semitism in those contexts, Zionism pulled inspiration from European settler colonialists and sought a settler colonial nationalist solution to the problem of anti-Semitism, one that necessitated for them the displacement and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And so as much as many Jewish people at first were not in support of a Jewish homeland in historic Palestine, colonial Zionists capitalized on the trauma of the Holocaust to garner support for Zionism as a settler colonial project. So in my research, and I don't want to spend too much time here, I'm primarily interested in how the governments of India, Israel, and the US appropriate yoga and spirituality within their state governments, their militaries, and their cultural institutions, and how they do this to conceal colonial and supremacist policies and state violence. The reason for my particular interest in these contexts is because of yoga's consumption within and across these three countries. To share some raw facts, the yoga industry is valued at upwards of $12 billion. I don't necessarily have data on Israel's yoga industry, but it's worth noting that some reports suggest that Israel boasts the highest number of practitioners and teachers of yoga per capita of population outside of any other nation. And significantly, ethnic studies scholar and author of the texts Undoing Border Imperialism and Border Rule, Harshawalia, she purports that India, Israel, and the US, that they encompass the most dangerous far-right ethno-nationalist alliance in the world. And so we know that these countries share military intelligence, arms, police exchange programs. But what I'm getting at in this story is that they also share cultural practices and strategies of using yoga as propaganda to conceal state violence. So yoga is not coincidentally popular in these societies. Yoga is essential to these ideological alliances. These are cultural bonds that connect ethno-nationalist states. And honestly, it won't be long before India follows in the steps of Israel and the US if we pay attention to what's happening in occupied Kashmir and with the recent passage and enactment of the Citizenship Amendment Act. So, some of us might already be familiar with the scholarship of Edward Said. In my scholarship, I pull from various sociologists, practitioner scholars, interdisciplinary researchers to anchor how I frame the weaponization of yoga through this lens of omwashing and decolonization. But I want to lift up the work of Edward Said and his framework of Orientalism, because I think it's helpful here for helping us think about what does omwashing look like and what does decolonization look like. According to Said, I think this quote he says, right, is really helpful, but Orientalism is this logic that stereotypes the West as scientific, logical, civilized, the East as this mystical, spiritually rich society. And it's served to justify imperial realities and colonial brutalities, right? But one of the things that Said also forewarned was Orientalism being internalized by those in the East, by people who look like me, right? He shared, my hope is to illustrate the formidable structure of cultural domination, and specifically for formerly colonized peoples, the dangers and temptations of employing the structure upon themselves. When internalized, Orientalism lends itself to a type of identity politics, or one that flattens the ethnic and racial identities of colonizers and colonized peoples. So I think applying Said's concept of Orientalism to yoga invites us to consider how conversations on colonialism, race, and yoga, while perhaps illuminating the harm of cultural appropriation and highlighting the erasure of South Asians from the global yoga industry, also rely on flattened notions of racial and ethnic identity, often through a nation-state lens, to frame solutions to decolonizing yoga. So in other words, when South Asians like far-right Prime Minister Narendra Modi says yoga is an ancient 5,000-year-old Indian tradition, he's using the language of Orientalism and decolonization to trap India in this essentialized place of the past and to advance a politics of Hindu nationalism, I argue. And I think I have two more examples, but I think I'll just race through them for the sake of time, but I'm happy to come back to them later. So I want to lift up this recent and egregious example of the weaponization and appropriation of yoga by far-right ethno-nationalists in India and Israel. Ways we might think about self-orientalization. Perhaps some of us saw in January, millions of Hindus flocked to the town of Ayodhya in Uttar Pradesh to celebrate the consecration of the Ram Mandir. This mandir that was a massive multi-million-dollar temple that was constructed atop the ruins of the Babri Masjid that was destroyed by Hindu vigilantes 30 years ago. And last week, after campaigning on behalf of the Ram Mandir, or last month, sorry, Modi and his BJP party, with full support from the Supreme Court, gained what they're calling a civilizational victory, right? The 600-year struggle against quote unquote Muslim invaders, they say. I lift this example up because it wasn't just people of Indian and Hindu backgrounds who celebrated the Ram Mandir's opening. Thanks to the support of Indian spiritual leaders like Sharath Joyce, if any of us know about the Mysore Ashtanga leader, grandson, Satguru of the Isha Foundation, and Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, who I spoke about earlier, Western and global followers of these saffron yogis also are being deceived into celebrating the Ram Mandir as a historic, sacred, and even spiritual victory. So in one of these videos, Sharath Joyce is talking about being invited to the celebration, and he's also leading chants in his yoga shala for people to celebrate this victory. A saffron yogi saffron is like the color of Hindu nationalism, or like the symbol of it. So a saffron yogi is one who endorses Hindu nationalism.
Have been invited.
Ooh. I'm not trying to play that. So the last example I want to hone in on, it's a case study of a yoga retreat program for Israeli veterans. It's called Brothers for Yoga. It was created in 2021 to serve Israeli military soldiers. It was founded by someone who served for War Minister Benny Gantz. Benny Gantz is the one who boasted he would bomb Gaza back to the Stone Age. And she created this basically yoga trauma program after spending several years in yoga ashrams in the United States and India. And so they do this on stolen land, right? And they seek to offer healing and trauma to Israeli soldiers. And I won't play this video, but more recently, after one of their retreat participants was unfortunately killed in the October 7th attack, they've been using his death to capitalize on the trauma and suffering of Israelis and to continue to fundraise for their weaponized healing efforts. So rather than taking the path of accountability and recognizing the occupation, displacement, harm, and trauma that their military inflicts on people in Palestine, it's a case study that offers a prime illustration of how power operates through yoga and how they're able to normalize settler colonialism and state violence and ethnic cleansing and genocide that they are enacting on Palestinians without even mentioning the 75+ year history of settler colonial violence, Nakba, and displacement. So if anyone wants the link, you can message me at some point, whether it's on. He literally took this video on October 7th, which is wild. Okay. So I just want to kind of bring it back to omwashing before we get into this bit of a gallery slide. In contrast to the self-orientalizing lens, one might consider what it would mean to apply an anti-imperial orientalist lens to the work of decolonizing yoga. The framework of omwashing invites us into an analysis of how far-right regimes and neoliberal and military institutions use yoga and mindfulness to conceal imperialism and repress state violence, and repressive state violence, how they use yoga to cement global alliances with each other. And I think that supplementing the efforts to decolonize yoga with not simply a representational lens, but an anti-imperial orientalist lens brings us to the framework of omwashing. And in thinking about decolonizing yoga and applying this to our work as yoga instructors, our work as, people who want to influence our yoga studios, I want to invite us into understanding what decolonizing yoga can look like in our practices. And so for me, that means going deeper than inserting underrepresented BIPOC identities. It means it has to refute the assumption that yoga has an inherently liberatory and romanticized past. It means understanding yoga to be neutral, and it means challenging instances of yoga being used to advance imperial state violence and situating and actively trying to situate yoga in a liberatory ethics. And so we're about to embark on a new exercise. That's the end of my lecture portion. We're going to do what I call a gallery gaze. It's kind of meant to be a silent meditative activity where we take in images and captions together. I'm going to navigate through the gallery, spending approximately like 15 seconds per image. Yeah, maybe if you just want to take a moment and read them, you're welcome to take snapshots if you want, but I just want to allow you to take them in. And so we'll begin. All right. I know that I may not have spent enough time, or maybe I spent too much time on certain images. The reason we're sharing them is because they are examples of the weaponization of yoga to us. But we want to know from y'all, how do you think these images are intended to make you feel? How did they make you feel? Who are you expected to identify with? What details do you notice? Who is not shown in these images? We're sharing them because we want to challenge the assumption that a yoga program is inherently positive, that it's inherently good. In this case, it's making soldiers be better at enacting genocide, right? So yoga can make you stronger at whatever it is you seek is your purpose. So there's this assumption that plugging a yoga program into a foundationally violent space is going to transform it to be less violent, less racist, less colonial. And for us, we believe that decolonizing yoga has to go deeper than simply, again, like inserting underrepresented identities in yoga spaces. And so we want to hear from y'all. And I'm just gonna, whenever Aniqa wants to take on the next role, I guess I'll stop sharing screen and let you take over. But I'll try and read in the chat what folks are sharing.
Everyone see my screen now? Perfect. Sheena, do you want to wrap up the chat portion and then I'll hop in?
Yeah, sure. I'm just trying to take in folks' responses. Thanks so much for sharing. Are there, Aniqa, did you want to have folks share for the sake of time? Do you want to just keep it to chat?
No, I think if people want to share, we can take 2 to 3 minutes and then we can keep moving.
Yeah. So if there are a couple folks who just want to, like, for the sake of, maybe you can raise your hand if you feel like there's like something you want to share back in terms of a response, but otherwise I'm also happy to read some of these aloud if people feel okay with that.
I think there's a raised hand.
Great. Najwa.
Yeah, yeah, I'm Najwa, and I think like what these images are trying to do is like um convey these people with a certain amount of depth, and also that like they have that these people who are complicit like in a genocidal colonial project have like that they both have compassion because they practice yoga, but also because they're practicing yoga that they deserve our compassion. There's a lot of language around like them being quote unquote traumatized and quote unquote reducing stress. So it's just another form of bypassing. And I do think, we are supposed to identify with these subjects, like seeing them practice yoga might make them more relatable. Um, I noticed a lot of uniforms, and I think that like honestly, people like us who know better and know truth about like colonialism, Zionism, and other forms of ethno-nationalism are the ones who are not supposed to see these images.
Thanks for sharing, Najwa. Is there anyone else who feels compelled to share? I'm simultaneously following this chat of just really amazing contributions from folks. Oh, great. Melissa and Zane, and then maybe we'll pass it over to Aniqa after that.
Hi. Hi. I just wanted to add to that, just saying like the deserving of compassion piece really resonated with me. And then something else that was coming to mind, seeing the as a yoga teacher and practitioner, I don't know, there's something there for me about like from those photos about like because they are practicing or it's as if their actions are coming from like a correct moral place. This like kind of connection between like practice and taking action from a clear place. And so yeah, there was something there when I was like watching those photos. I'm like, if like you could easily just like kind of pass by them and think, oh, right, because they are practicing, because they are after they kind of do the like the violent acts and then they're like lying down for shavasana or doing a meditation. It really means that what they're doing is like really intentional and really meaningful or something like that, right? And so it was really interesting. Yeah, it was really interesting to do that. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing, Melissa. Zane?
Yeah, well, all kinds of just barf emojis in response to that imagery I just watched. It was more than some of the stuff I'd seen, but some I had already. And it further reaffirmed some things I've been sharing with my students for a long time in yoga classes without losing their motivation to continue to practice, that yoga doesn't make you a good person doing yoga. Being a good person makes you a good person. Good posture does not make you a good person. Aligning your spine does not make you a good person. That all falls on your practice of morality and how you apply that. Same true with lifestyle of diet or being vegan, because a lot of my fellow vegans did not pass any vibe checks in the last 5 months. So having a healthy diet or spiritual practice like this doesn't necessarily make you a moral or good person.
Thanks, Zane. Deja, last comment, and then Aniqa can take it over.
Yeah, thanks for letting me share. I agree with what everyone said. And then it also, there was some thread there that when I was seeing all those pictures, it just hit me that it furthers the agenda of white supremacy culture and capitalism, that these professions are now trendy and cool because the trendy and cool thing of yoga has now permeated these professions. And so the relationship is clear. You can do one and do the other. And so it's an invitation into the society that honors the structure of police brutality, of policing, of a carceral nature and capitalism, and how that is just feeding so far away from what is the deeper meaning of these practices.
Okay. I think we'll keep moving. So Sheena talked a lot about violence at a systemic level and talked about how these are systems of oppression that are and how yoga is used to support and uphold these systems of oppression. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've seen more locally with our local studios and what we've heard echoed by a lot of folks as well, and really think about how one stage of the violence is using yoga to explicitly support and endorse genocide, but then there's this other more subtler form of violence in the form of silence on the topic of Palestine and a stance of neutrality and presenting things as both sides are equal, both sides just simply need to hold hands and make up, and then everything will be okay. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've seen, what my experience has been with this, and how as Yogis for Palestine, we have been calling folks into solidarity and also think about ways that we can disrupt the status quo in the industry of silence and neutrality as well. Drop any questions in the chat as we go. So post-October, we observed that in a lot of spiritual places, at first, there were very pro-Israel stances. We saw some studios post an Israeli flag in solidarity that did not mention Palestine or Palestinians. We saw flattened calls for nonviolence and ahimsa and peace that ignores the context of oppression, apartheid, and now genocide. We saw silence, business as usual, pretending that there's nothing going on. We saw neutrality, presenting things as both sides. And then in rare instances, we saw studios centering Palestine. And I want to call out Studio 34 in Philly. They've done an incredible job. Bhakti Yoga Movement Center in Portland, they've done an amazing job as well. So if y'all have spaces that are doing this, feel free to shout them out. Because that was not largely the case based on what we saw. And for me, the yoga studio that I was teaching at the time, they spoke about Black Lives Matter, they spoke about decolonization, they talked about social justice, and then they drew the line when it came to Palestine. And so in October, there was just so much heartbreak and disappointment around looking to folks for leadership on this topic, waiting for spaces to speak up, waiting for people to take a stand and name what is happening, and not seeing that. And so for us, a lot of our work is to introduce questions around how can we be intentional about using yoga for liberation. And so this is a slide that we have on our social media, and we pose the following questions. What is the responsibility of a yoga studio or teachers in the face of genocide of Palestinians? What does it mean for spaces to profit off of a practice that originates from BIPOC communities, but then stay silent or neutral as we witness a genocide? And within that, what does it mean for yoga spaces to be grounded in values of decolonization and justice? What does that look like, and how do we live into it? And then what does it look like for a studio space to be committed to these values and center the Palestinian struggle for liberation? How do we make that the central focus, and how do we show up as allies in this fight? And so for all of you, I invite you to really think about and really notice in your nervous system, how has it felt to be in your spiritual spaces? And for the last 6 months, how has that felt? And so there's really two questions that we're going to be thinking about for the next few slides. The first is, how can we recognize when our spaces are using yoga to normalize colonial violence and participate in spiritual bypassing? And then the second one is, are we disrupting or are we upholding the status quo of normalizing this violence? For me personally, I had hours of conversations with my studio at the time, lots of email back and forth, really explaining to them why they should be speaking up for Palestine, and it went nowhere. So in January, I decided to step down and drop out of my advanced training program, because to me, it felt very clear that I did not want to learn from somebody that was silent in this moment and keep investing in a teacher training program. And I didn't want to keep teaching at a studio that has a lot of brown and black teachers, but do not stand up for the genocide of brown bodies. So those things were clear. And for me personally, I wanted to step away and write a public statement calling them in. And I just want to name that the studio, I don't work full time at the studio. That's not my 9 to 5. I have a 9 to 5, and I want to name the privilege there, in that it is easier for me to step away had my full livelihood not it because my full livelihood is not tied to the studio. And so I'm not advocating that teachers resign from their spaces, but what I do want to call us into and have us think about is, what are the ways that we can disrupt the status quo, and how can we introduce Palestine and keep advocating for Palestine in our roles as teachers, students, members, and so on? Because either we're complicit or we are disrupting. It's one or the other. I'm going to take us through a framework. Sheena introduced this framework during her Decolonizing Yoga workshop, and I want to come back to it. I've linked the paper that at the bottom, and it really talks about how we critically embody the decolonized yoga. And on the left is some principles of decolonized yoga, what it can and should look like. And the second side is really, how is it lived into in spiritual places, particularly in this moment. So the first one is decolonized yoga. It disrupts dominant cultural narratives of yoga, and it understands that the experience the experience of oppression in the world is generated by systemic forces that are linked. Settler colonialism, racial capitalism, casteism, so on. It is all linked, and they all uphold one another. And the work of liberation means going against the grain and disrupting dominant culture, not upholding it. So are our spiritual places, are they fighting to uphold dominant culture, or are they fighting to disrupt it? Are they naming these systems of violence? Are they naming what is happening? Silence and neutrality on Palestine is the equivalent of upholding dominant culture and oppressive systems. There has been so much effort around censorship, particularly on the topic of Palestine on social media, in the Western media. So much focus to silence people and silence voices speaking up. And is that being replicated in our studio spaces? The second one is a decolonized yoga practice critically engages with classical Indian and Hindu philosophical texts instead of accepting them as inherently just and liberatory. Yoga philosophy can be interpreted to uphold harm or dismantle harm. We've seen Zionists use the word ahimsa as a call for genocide and war. And ahimsa can mean different things to different people. And how are our spiritual places using these concepts and these philosophies? Because every yoga philosophy can so beautifully be used for collective liberation, but it can also be used towards upholding these very harmful systems. The third one, decolonized yoga honors the interconnectedness of humanity and all living beings in nature on and off the mat. Our suffering and our struggle and our liberation is interconnected, and we cannot ignore that by focusing on the individual. A lot of what we've seen in this time is that people are using yoga to bypass, people are using yoga to escape. At my studio at the time, members, they wanted to escape what was happening, and the studio really considered their feelings and sentiments in not speaking up about Palestine. And it's a really toxic mentality that prioritizes individual self-care at the expense of collective liberation and suffering. I'm going to keep going. Please put questions in chat. Decolonized yoga works towards justice and liberation for all living beings. And I really mean all living beings. And so do spaces that talk about liberation and collective liberation, do they actually center liberation for all beings, or is it a few? Who is being centered? A decolonized yoga centers marginal bodies, voices, and groups, particularly BIPOC folks. Who are our spiritual spaces centering? Whose needs are they protecting? Whose privilege and comfort are they protecting? Whose voice is being upheld? And then last but not the least, decolonized yoga shares yoga in democratic and non-hierarchical ways. Who holds power in these spaces? And is this power showing up in top-down ways or bottom-up? Is the stance of our studios top-down, and do they represent the views of those who hold power, or do they represent the views of people in the community? At the studio that I taught at, majority of the teachers were speaking up for Palestine on social media, but the studio has been silent and neutral because white Zionist members do not want the studio to speak up. So whose privilege are they protecting? So yeah, I just want to kind of leave you all with some of these as you think about what decolonized yoga can look like and how you can think about how you're experiencing these in your spiritual spaces. And then I really just want to talk about collective power and the power to disrupt. And I want to go back to this one point. Decolonized yoga shares yoga in democratic and non-hierarchical ways. And in this moment, this movement, it's not about individuals. It's not about me. It's not about Sheena. It's not about Yogis for Palestine. It's not about any one person. It is about all of us coming together in solidarity. And we all have the power to lead in this moment. Y'all, there's teachers with thousands of hours of teaching experience, thousands of trainings, people that have led retreats and trainings all over the world that don't know how to show up in this moment or have chosen to bypass in this moment. And for all of us that are feeling this pain in this moment and we are being called in, that is a sacred voice, and we should be listening to that. There is so much wisdom in that pain and that voice that a lot of our spiritual leaders, they don't have. Either they don't have it or they have it and they're not listening to it. Either way, it's the same. So can we listen to our own voices, and can we transform and alchemize that energy into action? And really, if our spiritual gurus, leaders, experts are bypassing in this moment, they have no right to call themselves a spiritual leader. So how can we all step into leadership instead? We all have incredible power individually and collectively. So how can we use that power and that voice to usher in change in solidarity with Palestine? And what does that look like for all of you? Okay, so we have a couple of ways that we've been practicing showing up and a couple of ways that we want to offer up that we can start to show up collectively into leadership here. So the first is to speak up consistently. Question your spiritual spaces and leaders. This goes for both members and teachers that are teaching in studios or spaces. And be knowledgeable about the history of Palestine and be ready to push back against harmful narratives because the pushback is there and it's going to come up with every like there's always going to be things that we know people will say, but Hamas is a big one. And really knowing how to respond to those is going to be helpful as we have these conversations. And don't be afraid to push back and have this conversation repeatedly. Don't let it be a one and done. Be assertive and be relentless. There are some helpful resources that we've linked here. Palestine Diaspora Movement has a Palestine 101 course. It's actually really helpful. It walks you through the history of occupation and apartheid, and it's super easy to follow. And then Let's Talk Palestine has also created this graphic. It's particularly around helpful context for frustrating conversations about Gaza. So it goes through this. It will walk you through some of the common arguments and pushback that comes up and how you can think about responding to them. So just a little bit of a guide and support if you're having these conversations. The second one is action. Be an example. Encourage students and people in your community to find protests and marches. Share protests to your social media. Talk about the actions that you're taking and really let people know how you personally are living into this and model the way. The third one is educate. So staying up to date on news, critical analysis on the ground, and uplifting Palestinian voices, and then learning more about settler colonialism, apartheid, and revolutionary struggle. Education is a big part of learning how to show up in solidarity and have better conversations. I've been reading this book that is amazing. It's called Trinity of Fundamentals by Wissam Rafidi, and it's really from the perspective of a resistance fighter, and it's very powerful. Highly recommend it if anybody is looking for more reading. And then boycott and divest, being intentional about where we spend our money. It should not be profitable for spiritual spaces to stay silent during a genocide. So how can we lean into the boycott movement to usher in change and solidarity with Palestine? This really this is one place where members have a lot of power. You can have these conversations and you can use your dollars to usher in change. People might not listen when you're talking about things, but people will listen if you say, hey, as a member, this is why I support this space, and it's important to me that these concerns are addressed. Solidarity events. Can you center Palestine in spaces and call others into solidarity? We've been hosting a lot of different events, and there are a few screenshots over here. We held a collective care space where it was a 3-hour workshop where we came together to move and really alchemize our emotion, and then really talk about actions that we can take in service to Palestine. All of these events have been fully donation based, 100%, and we've been hosting them at Studio 34 Philly locally. We've hosted ongoing Palestine Solidarity series where we've had rotating teachers come and offer a practice, and then at the end we typically talk about what actions are happening that week and have folks make announcements. It's a space for everybody to come together and center the struggle, process some of what we're witnessing, and then turn that into action, because that action is really the big piece. Okay, so I said a lot, and now we're gonna pivot to breakout groups again, the same breakout group that y'all were in. So we're gonna go back into that, and then for the next 5 minutes or so, we're gonna talk about ways that you have used or can use yoga to interrupt Zionism, and then talk about how we can do that in yoga studios or our own spaces. And then we can talk about some examples of interrupting, omwashing, and spiritual bypassing. So we'll put y'all back into your groups, and then in about 5 minutes or so, we'll come back and we'll chat. Perfect. Okay, thank you all for getting into your breakout room. We're hoping to hear from a few folks if they want to unmute and share what came up. Ideas, actions, thoughts. Yeah, Carrie, you raised your hand. You're on mute.
sorry. I find this tension, I guess, as a person of color, between, and I know safety is an illusion, but I also know that like it's a challenge in order to be able to go into unfriendly territories and talk about this. And I want to be able to fully, wholeheartedly say, we need to end this occupation because that's the truth. And there's a lot of going on there. So I'm gonna stop because I don't know if my safety is that important. And I would like to be safe. I hope that all made sense.
Yes, and your safety is important. So thank you for naming that and calling that out. We have a few more folks raising hands, Jamie and then Dima.
Hi, thank you so much. This presentation could be easily a weekend or a week long. There's so much I've received and I'm really grateful. I just want to say where I live in so-called Ashland, Oregon, it's a very small town, and we have been doing protests and speaking at the city council, and the local university was having a talk where the local Zionist-based rabbi was going to be present. So a group of us showed up to engage in the conversation in the panel, but we weren't allowed in because we weren't affiliated with the university. So we did a silent protest, and that led to an online summit that's going to happen. We're putting on in 2 weeks just to, it's called Kura, which is Culture of Unity and Repair in Ashland. So we're going to have several different speakers who have done different repair work in community and open up, hopefully build bridges to have real conversation about this. And now that I've been here today, I see what it's like modeled for me, what it looks like to go lean directly into the topic and show. So I'm gonna stop talking, but that's what we're doing, is an online summit for our local community.
That's amazing. Thank you. And let us know how it goes. We can share it as well.
Okay, thank you.
And then we have Dima.
Hi, can you hear me all right? My connection's a little sweet. So I live on unceded Abenaki land, also known as Vermont in the eastern US. And for those who don't know, it's an incredibly white state and like very little BIPOC yoga teachers. And so for myself, so the ideas / action that I first thought of that would be realistic in terms of considering safety, individual safety, community safety, but then also like thinking about human psychology, and how like what kind of communication gets through to people, even though like technically it's not our full responsibility to like dismantle like someone who refuses to let go of their propaganda. Like that is a community effort, definitely. But what I was thinking of for myself was to gather with friends and community members to like step into the yoga spaces that I have felt really uncomfortable teaching in and have barely been teaching in because I'm like one of 2 BIPOC teachers. And all the classes are like people in like basically like those magazines that we had viewed a couple minutes ago, just the stereotypes of what it means to like what is a yogic body, what is a yogic practice, etc., and not really analyzing that. And so for myself as a Palestinian, as someone who is very much so like tokenized and also like fetishized in Vermont, my idea was that it would be safer emotionally to come with a group of people as a student rather than as a teacher, since like yes, I'm in a position of power as a teacher, but then like I'm within the position of like being kicked out of the organization or whatever. So the thought was to come with a group of friends and start like disrupting, but like coming into classes to practice with others, and showing that space and like bringing in commentary, so that the others in that class who are primarily like white femmes who are older, to just show them that these are things that the community is talking about, and that this space is not for you to just take a breath and like only think about yourself and get a deep stretch. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And having that collective, that community is so important. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to lean into that, because what we have heard is that people feel very isolated, and these spaces are so important. Any other thoughts or ideas? Okay, if anybody does have anything they want to share, feel free to chime in, but we will open it up to general Q&A to talk about any questions that came up throughout all of this, or anything at all. So we'll just open it up and then we can take questions. You can raise your hand, you can unmute and jump in, you can put your questions in chat.
If we also want to see everyone's faces, we could come off share screen for a bit.
There you go, good idea.
Yeah. You can also take collective breaths together. But I'm sure there are some points of whether it's other examples or questions that you have.
Yes, Susanna.
Hi. Yeah, I'm very grateful for this presentation and opportunity to explore together. And I think I don't exactly have a question. I think it's more like just offering up like a reflection that is like, I think it can be very vulnerable to do this work. And so and there's a lot of ways where I often feel like I'm not doing it in the best way possible, and where I know I could do it better and try to be open to feedback. And so I just want to name, like, for me, a lot of this is like continued learning, continuing to show up, and then being in community like this one. So yeah, I just wanted to share that because I try to use my platform as much as I can, and connect yogic philosophy to the absolute need to, take action for Palestinian liberation. And so I just want to name, like, an openness, whether it's here, like in my DMs or wherever people would want to offer, like, things they would like or prefer to see, or issues, because I know I'm someone who holds a positionality, right? And I think it's important to just name that I'm open to that relationship and to accountability and to continuing to do better. I'm complete.
Thank you.
Grateful.
Yeah, thank you so much for offering that up. I had a hard time not texting Sheena that Susanna's in our workshop, excitedly. So I appreciate you being here. And I think that vulnerability and being open to learning and feedback is so critical. Half the time I feel like I have no idea what I'm doing. It's sort of just thinking about what the next right thing is in the moment. And it's definitely imperfect, and there's probably way better ways to do it. And there's an urgency, and there's so much, it's also so important. So I think that however we show up, however imperfect it is, that we show up. Oh, wait, I was speaking, but I think I was on mute.
We're good.
Oh, wait, I'm good. Okay, cool. Okay, we have one more hand raised.
Sahar.
Hi. I just kind of mentioned this in our little breakout group where I was saying, if COVID taught me anything, is that if you don't find like-minded folks in your area, find it online. Just find people that have the same values, that care about the same things, and connect with them online, because the isolation is really hard to feel like you're the only one or one of the only few people that cares about things. So I think that has been really powerful for me, to even just connecting with people online who share the same values. And I'm always happy to connect with people as well. It's like we can work on things online together. We could just talk. We could have an online yoga class together. But yeah, just finding community where we can.
Anything else? Questions, thoughts, additions?
I have something to add if there's time.
Mm-hmm.
So something I've been chatting with people about is this idea of like how we can't help but compare what we're doing, and are we doing enough, and are we doing it right, and are we showing up in the right way? And I think, to just add on to what was just shared, the idea that you can find spaces that you can participate in that feel like intentional community for you, and maybe respite in this time too, so that you can do what actions you are doing, is really important. But I also wanted to add this one little thing, which is, notice if you're excluding talking about that part of your day when you're in conversation with other people and they're talking about their day and you're sharing about your day, but for whatever reason, you don't mention that you went to a solidarity support group, or you don't mention that you made calls today. And I just wanted to highlight that, because it's so small and it might be done as a way to protect oneself, but we have that impulse maybe to consider discomfort as a true lack of safety when those two are not the same. And so kind of addressing, yeah, today I went to this 2-hour teach-in by Yogis for Palestine. I took a nap. That's what I'll do later. And, I organized with some friends, or I just relaxed and watched TV. But it could be as simple as that. And omitting it, I think, creates the idea that our communities are separate. But if we're trying to be integrated and share our passion and our interest in really like ending this occupation and liberation for the Palestinian people and everyone, I think it just needs to be named, however it can be named.
Thank you, Thajal. I'm gonna go back to sharing screen for just a quick moment to recap some of our next steps with this beautiful space that we've created today. I'm really grateful to everyone for sharing their ideas. We don't want to stop hearing from you. We don't want to, we are committed to doing this work both until the end of this genocide and until we see and realize a free Palestine. We just want to encourage you to be in touch with us, whether you want to email us at yogisforpalestine@gmail.com. We also want to make our platform available in ways that you have ideas, even though we're based in Philly. You can follow us and, keep in touch with us. You can sign on to our solidarity statement. Thanks, Thajal, for including it in the chat. I know Aniqa is also invested and excited about creating a Slack. I've never used one before, but I'm really here for it to stay connected and share ideas as a space for us to kind of maybe give examples of how we're disrupting Zionism, to be in community together as ways people have already shared as perhaps being a way to make us feel connected or allow us to feel connected. And my hope and dream is to really see if there are others who want to build on ideas for a cultural boycott of Zionist and Hindutva yoga campaigns. So I don't know what that could look like, right? In terms of a material reality, but I know that cultural and academic boycotts are an important part of interrupting apartheid, are an important part of interrupting settler colonial genocide. And Israelis love yoga retreats. So I don't know. what are ways to kind of think about doing this work? And if that's something that's of interest to you, to be able to kind of move with this, then please give us ideas, be involved, let us know how you want to be involved and bring your ideas. We don't necessarily want this to be like a hierarchical space. We want it to be like a space where we can kind of generate ideas together. And just a final quote, yoga as a path to liberation requires being in solidarity with oppressed people around the world, particularly with the people of Palestine at this moment. We invoke the essence of our yoga values and call on yoga practitioners to refuse to breathe in the colonial propaganda that conceals a genocidal reality. Instead, may we breathe in and activate solidarity for all oppressed people's struggles for freedom, dignity, and self-determination in this moment. That was written on October 17th when Aniqa and I wrote the second statement for Yogis for Palestine. And then finally, we want to make sure we give you an understanding and transparency of where your donations are going. From what I saw last, a lot of folks registered at the end. I think it might have been like near $1,000 that you and I and all of us have collectively raised to be able to give to the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, which is a U.S.-based political home for all who believe that the freedom for the Palestinian people is an integral part of achieving our collective liberation. So thank you all so much for your contributions, for allowing us to make this work hopefully useful to interrupting Zionism, to really demanding a free Palestine. Please, stay in touch with us. Don't let this be the last time that Aniqa and I and Thejal and Ria and ABCD Yogi hear from you. So I'm going to check the chat, but Aniqa, do you want to share anything?
No, just so happy and so honored to be in this space with all of you. And I hope that we can continue this virtually, that isolation is real and we're not alone. We have each other.
Thank you
Yay.
all so much for being here. Really appreciate all of you. And thank you so much, Sheena, Aniqa, Thejal. It's been a pleasure and just really looking forward to staying connected with everyone and building together. Thank you.